Hello, and welcome to this lecture on adrenocortical hormones. My name is Valerie, and I'm here to take you through this lecture on endocrine physiology. Learning objectives. In this lecture, you should be able to describe the location and structure of the adrenal glands, identify the hormones produced by the adrenal cortex, identify the hormones produced by the adrenal medulla, and discuss the actions of adrenal hormones. The adrenal glands. These are also referred to as the suprarenal glands, and they're located in the posterior abdomen between the kidney and the diaphragm. The adrenal glands consist of an outer connective tissue capsule, an outer cortex, and an inner medulla. The adrenal glands have a rich blood supply and experience one of the highest rates of blood flow in the body. This is because they receive blood supply from several large arteries branching off the aorta, including the suprarenal and renal arteries. Blood flows to each adrenal gland at the cortex and then drains into the adrenal medulla. Adrenal hormones are released into circulation through the left and right suprarenal veins. As we just mentioned, the adrenal glands are composed of an outer cortex and an inner medulla, which are all surrounded by a connective tissue capsule. The outer cortex is more glandular, whereas the inner medulla is composed of nervous tissue. The cortex can be subdivided into additional zones, all of which produce different types of hormones. The three zones are called the zona glomerulosa, zona fasciculata, and the zona reticularis. The order of these zones can be remembered with the mnemonic GFR, glomerulosa, fasciculata, and reticularis. The zona glomerulosa produces aldosterone, which belongs to a class of hormones called mineralocorticoids. The zona fasciculata produces glucocorticoids, such as cortisol. And the zona reticularis, which is the innermost region of the cortex, produces androgens, which are sex hormones. So there's another mnemonic to help you remember these hormones in order. It's salt, sugar, sex. The deeper you go, the sweeter it gets. So salt is mineralocorticoids, sugar is glucocorticoids, and sex is androgens. And these correspond to the GFR, salt, sugar, sex. And then the adrenal medulla is going to produce hormones for stress, like epinephrine and norepinephrine. The zona glomerulosa is the most superficial region of the adrenal cortex. The zona glomerulosa produces a group of hormones known as mineralocorticoids. They are called mineralocorticoids because of their effect on body minerals such as sodium and potassium. These hormones are essential for fluid and electrolyte balance. Mineralocorticoids basically function to retain sodium and excrete potassium and hydrogen ions out of the body and into the urine. So we want to increase sodium or retain sodium and get rid of potassium and hydrogen or acid. So they do this by increasing the renal absorption of sodium, meaning that we're taking the sodium that was in the urine or filtrate and reabsorbing it back into the blood. And by getting rid of the potassium and hydrogen ions, or the acid, means that we're taking the potassium and the hydrogen ions from the blood and secreting them out of the body into the urine. These actions are important in the setting of hyperkalemia. Hyperkalemia is increased serum potassium. When there's too much potassium in the blood, aldosterone increases renal secretion of potassium, which restores the potassium levels back to normal. So, we already know that aldosterone is a mineralocorticoid. In fact, it's the strongest mineralocorticoid produced in the human body. So, as a mineralocorticoid, that means aldosterone is going to regulate sodium and potassium by the means we just discussed on the previous slide. Aldosterone has another very important function though, which is that it is a key component in something called RAS. RAS stands for renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. The RAS system can be a little overwhelming, so just try to bear with me and then maybe on your own try to draw it out a few times. Drawing stuff out is the best way to learn endocrine as a whole, or at least in my opinion. The goal of RAS is to maintain the body's blood pressure and/or volume. So RAS is only activated in times of low blood volume or low blood pressure. When the blood drops or blood volume is depleted, receptors in the kidney detect this change and they will secrete an enzyme called renin as a response. Renin will then catalyze the conversion of a protein called angiotensinogen into angiotensin 1. Angiotensinogen is produced in the liver. angiotensin 1 is converted to angiotensin 2 in the lungs via something called ACE, or angiotensin converting enzyme. Angiotensinogen 2. Angiotensinogen 2 has three main functions. It's going to cause vasoconstriction of arterioles, which causes decreased blood flow. It's going to increase reabsorption of salt, sodium chloride, and water, which increases blood volume. It's going to stimulate the adrenal cortex to secrete aldosterone, which, as we just mentioned, through its actions as a mineralocorticoid, is going to further help increase and restore the blood pressure and volume. The whole concept of RAS is incredibly important, especially for people who have high blood pressure. Clinically, people with high blood pressure are often prescribed ACE inhibitors. By inhibiting ACE, this blocks the RAS system from maintaining an elevated blood pressure. Zona fasciculata. The intermediate region of the adrenal cortex is the zona fasciculata, which is named as such because the cells form small fascicles, or bundles, which are separated by tiny blood vessels. The zona fasciculata produces hormones called glucocorticoids. Glucocorticoids got their name because of their role in glucose metabolism. The most important of these glucocorticoids is cortisol. The liver converts some of cortisol into cortisone. In response to long-term stressors, the hypothalamus secretes CRH, which signals the anterior pituitary to release ACTH. ACTH triggers the release of glucocorticoids. Their overall effect is to inhibit tissue building while stimulating the breakdown of stored nutrients to maintain adequate fuel supplies. In conditions of long-term stress, for example, cortisol promotes the catabolism of glycogen into glucose, the catabolism of stored triglycerides into fatty acids, also known as lipolysis, and glycerol, and the catabolism of muscle proteins into amino acids. These raw materials can then be used to synthesize additional glucose and ketones for use as body fuels. The hippocampus, which is part of the temporal lobe of the cerebral cortex, is an important aspect in memory formation. It is highly sensitive to stress levels because of its glucocorticoid receptors. Zona reticularis, or sex. The deepest region of the adrenal cortex is the zona reticularis, which produces small amounts of a class of steroid sex hormones called androgens. During puberty and most of adulthood, androgens are produced in the gonads. The androgens produced in the zona reticularis supplement the gonadal androgens. They are produced in response to ACTH from the anterior pituitary, and then they're converted in the tissues to testosterone or estrogen. In adult women, androgens may contribute to the sex drive, but their function in adult men is not well understood. In postmenopausal women, as the functions of the ovaries decline, the main source of estrogens become the androgens produced by the zona reticularis. In this slide, we're going to talk about the adrenal medulla. So, in contrast to the adrenal cortex, who releases glucocorticoids in response to long-term stress, such as severe illness, the adrenal medulla is going to release its hormones in response to acute stress, acute short-term stress, mediated by the sympathetic nervous system, or SNS. The medullary tissue is composed of unique postganglionic SNS neurons called chromaffin cells, which are large and irregularly shaped. They produce the neurotransmitters epinephrine, or adrenaline, and norepinephrine. Epinephrine is produced in greater quantities, about a 4:1 ratio with norepinephrine. Epinephrine is also more powerful than norepinephrine. Because the chromaffin cells release epinephrine and norepinephrine into the systemic circulation, where they travel widely and exert effects onto distant cells, they're considered hormones. Derived from the amino acid tyrosine, norepinephrine and epinephrine are chemically classified as catecholamines. The secretion of medullary epinephrine and norepinephrine is controlled by a neural pathway that originates from the hypothalamus in response to danger or stress. Both epinephrine and norepinephrine signal the liver and skeletal muscles to convert glycogen into glucose, resulting in increased blood glucose levels. These hormones increase the heart rate, the pulse, and the blood pressure to prepare the body to fight the perceived threat or flee from it. In addition, the pathway dilates the airways, raising blood oxygen levels. It also prompts vasodilation, further increasing the oxygenation of important organs such as the lungs, the brain, the heart, and skeletal muscle. At the same time, epinephrine is going to trigger vasoconstriction of the blood vessels, which are serving less essential organs. So if we are in our fight or flight response, we want to vasodilate and oxygenate the organs that are most essential, like the brain, heart, and skeletal muscle. And then we want to constrict the blood vessels that are less essential, like the GI tract, the kidneys, and the skin. This slide is just a summary of the adrenal gland's hormones. So the adrenal cortex secretes steroid hormones that are important for the regulation of long-term stress, blood pressure and blood volume control, nutrient uptake and storage, and fluid and electrolyte balance, as well as inflammation. So the adrenal cortex is going to produce aldosterone, cortisol, cortisone, corticosterone. So these are going to be steroid hormones. So we know that aldosterone is a mineralocorticoid, and it's going to work to increase blood sodium levels and excrete potassium. And we also know that cortisol, also a steroid hormone, is going to increase blood glucose levels. And cortisol increases blood glucose levels through the stimulation of gluconeogenesis. It also acts as an anti-inflammatory and immunosuppression. And then the adrenal medulla is going to produce epinephrine and norepinephrine, which are not steroid hormones. They are amine hormones, which are going to stimulate the fight or flight response. Remember, epinephrine is adrenaline.